grapple with the immigration crisis in a novel? Laila Lalami will join us to talk about her new book, The Other Americans. What can you do to resist the attention economy? Jenny Odell will be here to talk about her book, How to Do Nothing. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Laila Lalami joins us now from Los Angeles. Her new book is called The Other Americans, and it's reviewed this week in the Book Review. Laila, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you've written several books, and I actually want you to start with your most recent novel and kind of how you got from that book, which is very different from your current book, to this new project. So let's begin with The Moor's Account. What was that book about?
So The Moor's Account is based on the true story of the first African explorer of America. And I came across his story really quite by chance. I was reading a book on Moorish Spain, and very casually the author, who is actually a Moroccan scholar, his name is Anwar Majid, mentioned a Moroccan slave who had been brought to Florida in 1528 with a Spanish expedition and ended up being one of the few survivors of that expedition and one of the first outsiders to ever cross what is now the United States. The trouble was that once they were found and brought to Mexico City, which at that time was the seat of the sort of Spanish Empire in the New World, only the Spanish gentlemen were asked to provide testimony about their experiences, and the slave's testimony was never recorded. So the conceit of the novel is that we hear this entire journey of exploration, this story of adventure, this story of transformation, but from the perspective of this Moroccan slave. In my novel, he's referred to as Mustafa, and so that's The Moor's Account.
So that was a big, well-researched historical novel. This is something very different. So talk about sort of how you, do you react a little bit off of, enough of that for now?
Sort of. I was tired by the end of that project because it had involved so much research and just it consumed my life for 5 years, and I was tired, and I thought, for my next project, I want to do a novel that's set in contemporary times, no more research. And so this new book, The Other Americans, really started almost immediately after I turned in the copy edits for The Moor's Account. I received the text from my sister in the middle of the night telling me that our father had taken ill and he was in the hospital in Morocco, and I had to basically travel there and say goodbye to him before he died. And when I got there, very fortunately, he recovered and he's perfectly fine now. But when I returned to Los Angeles, I brought back that fear with me, and I decided that I would write a story about that fear and sort of like make it come true and sort of explore it really in the space of a novel. And that's where the idea of The Other Americans came from. It's the story of this young woman who returns home after she finds out that her father has been killed in a hit and run. And so the book basically explores the death of this immigrant from multiple perspectives of people who are connected to him.
When was that your father became ill and you went back to Morocco?
2014.
See, that's interesting because, of course, this feels very much like a post-2016 novel in that it really is, very much concerned. Not that immigrants did not exist before 2016, but obviously the political landscape that we're living in and social landscape has shifted since then. Were you still working on it after the election and the first Trump administration policies on the borders became apparent? And did that change your conception or the way in which you were approaching the novel?
This is a question that has come up a lot as I was touring with this book. So as you heard, I was working on it well before. And I think at that point, by the time the election happened, I think I must have been on my third draft. So all of the story, the characters, the conceit, the what happens, the ending, everything had been sorted out, in the drafting, and the rest was I was just revising and refining things and the different voices. And then the election happened, and I spent quite some time weeping, and then I returned to the book, and I read it, and I realized immediately that it would read a bit differently to a particular kind of reader, perhaps the kind of reader who is not as sort of attuned to what has been going on with immigration. And one of the issues with somebody like, for example, like the president who speaks in such vulgar terms about immigrants is that he presents really this image of the immigrant at the border as a threat to national security, as a villain, this horrible caricatures that he creates. And the flip side of that, and I think oftentimes it comes from well-meaning progressives, is to present the image of the very successful immigrant. You can imagine the founders of these major tech companies or these innovators and so on and so forth. And neither image really captures the huge range of experiences that the 40 million of immigrants that we have in this country have. And in the book, since the book is really just about an ordinary man who, with his wife, moves to the United States in 1981 and builds a new life for himself, becomes this sort of restaurant owner. He's, a minor success in his field, and he lives in a small town. He's not overly concerned with what is happening with politics on a grand scale, but that politics still does come and find him. And the book really looks at these diverse experiences. So the Moroccan immigrant and his wife, their children, one of whom is born in the United States, the other brought here as a toddler and has her own experience of what it's like to come to this country as a child. The witness to the crime happens to be an undocumented immigrant. And so he faces a moral dilemma about whether he should come forward with what he's seen or not, because coming forward means an encounter with law enforcement, with all of the possible implications of that. And then the rest of the characters are all born in the United States, some of them internally displaced. For example, the detective is somebody who's from Washington, D.C., moves to a small town, and others who have never lived outside of their small town. So it's basically looking at this connection between the person and their environment. What happens when you move thousands of miles away? How does that experience sort of affect you, your sense of self, your sense of identity, your sense of belonging? And for people who don't have that experience, what does it mean to not have that experience and to look at the world around you changing because people are moving in? So it's really looking at that experience quite apart from what you see in, for example, the rhetoric of the president. And that is why when the election happened, I faced the choice. It was either to sort of take the story in this newer direction or to leave it alone. And I decided to leave it exactly alone, which is what I had been writing the whole time.
You're just incredibly prescient. You, in addition to having a wide diversity of characters, you also have 9 different narrators in the book. Was that a choice from the get-go, and why that approach?
Well, in the beginning, I had 3 main characters that are essentially telling the story. The daughter of the immigrant, the detective who's investigating the crime, and the daughter's love interest. And it was working fine. I had my hands full with those 3.
Yes, that's enough.
But even so, I just felt like something was missing, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Something wasn't quite working. I think I was having trouble moving the story forward and kind of giving it as much complexity as I would have wanted. But, I was on my 3rd draft. I thought, maybe I should show this to my editor. And so I showed it to my editor at Pantheon, Errol MacDonald. And he has this wonderful ability to ask just the right question. And his question was, do you think that these other characters, the more minor characters that you have in the story, do you think that maybe you've shortchanged them? They're so interesting. Have you considered maybe including some of them in your perspective? And it was sort of this light bulb moment, because I realized that if I expanded my perspective, then for the reader, the experience changes. And the reader is then able to move the story for me in a way, because each time a character speaks, there's a certain assumption of what's happened in between the voices speaking. And so the story moves in the head of the reader. And it was new and it was kind of a challenge, and that attracted me, the idea of expanding to more characters, and I ended up settling on the 9 that you have in the book. But I had such great fun doing this because I had never done a polyphonic novel before. So this was a new thing to me, and I loved working on it.
What was the hardest thing about having those 9 different characters for you?
Well, for me, I would say the hardest was writing about people who, quite frankly, I would not want to know in real life. There is one character in particular that was just quite a challenge, because how do you write someone who in your core you believe to be a racist, first of all, and also just violent and just a terrible human being all around, but how do you write about that person? And one of the advantages of the first-person point of view is that it is this internal monologue from the point of view of this character, and no one calls themselves a racist. Like, the very first thing that most racists say is, I'm not a racist,
right?
but, dot, dot, dot. And so that's because the voice that we use to talk to ourselves is most of the time maximally empathetic. And
yes.
So then my task as a writer was to apply that to that character and to suspend judgment and to try and basically teleport myself into his body and look at the world through his eyes. How does he react to a world that's changing around him?
How'd you do that?
Well, that's basically the job, right? It's basically looking at, someone like that. I remember, for example, I'll never forget this, but after the Charlottesville event, somebody went in. I can't remember. It might have been Vice. I can't remember who it was. But they went and they interviewed one of those neo-Nazis. His name is Christopher Cantwell, I think. And he was weeping. He was crying. He was saying how he was the real victim in all of this. How, he's an honest man. It was just the most incredible thing I had ever seen. And so that's what I mean when I say that the voice we use with ourselves is empathetic, always. So with creating this character, that was the challenge. Is, can I do this? Can I talk about him withholding judgment? And one key I have found is to sort of go back into his own private history, the sum of his experiences that have led him to become this person. And if I did that, then that helped me to do that internal monologue, him narrating his life and sort of the experiences he's had. Now, you might disagree about his reactions to some of these events, but the events still happened, and that, for me, was a key.
So much of differentiating these different voices, these different viewpoints and narrators is about the language itself and the way in which they each sort of talk and frame things. And I'm curious, you have a doctorate in linguistics.
I do.
Does that training, does that help and sort of inform how you do this as a novelist?
I mean, I suppose it does, because you look at language analytically, you can break down the syntax of how a person might speak, some of the semantic choices that they make. You're a bit more attuned, I would say, to how foreign languages kind of happen to be included in your speech, so things like code switching even. And so I suppose that really does help in writing these characters. With one of them, the mother, who moved here 35 years before the book starts, basically. With her, I wanted to use, for example, these really long paragraphs that contained almost run-on sentences. And so for something like that, that was kind of a fun challenge at the syntactic level to make that happen. For another character who's a veteran of the Iraq War, for that one, I was looking more closely, not so much at the syntax, but more at sort of the word choices that he was using, because I wanted to sort of convey this like authority that this is, this really is a veteran and this is how they speak about something as simple as how they refer to the hat that the drill instructor uses. There's a special word for that. So just trying to capture for each character some element of their language, their own idiosyncratic language, and to have that represented on the page to make it easier for the reader to keep track of who is speaking.
You live in Southern California and also teach creative writing at the University of California at Riverside. I imagine there is a diverse population of students there, many of them perhaps immigrants or children of immigrants themselves. And I'm curious if these themes you're grappling with in real life and in this novel, The Other Americans, are these things that you're concerns and issues that you're hearing from your students as well? And are they looking to grapple with it in their own fiction writing?
Absolutely. So the University of California at Riverside is a Hispanic serving institution. It's also the most diverse of the 10 campuses of the University of California. We have a fantastic student body. These kids, man, they're so great. And particularly, so I'm talking about the undergraduate student body in particular. And, it's always interesting having these discussions with them. So recently, for example, I taught Valeria Luiselli's short book, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions in one of my nonfiction classes. And they loved it because even though many of them are either immigrants or come from immigrant backgrounds, their parents might have been immigrants or their grandparents might have been immigrants, they still didn't have some of that perspective that the book provides on what actually happens at the border. And this is where it's so dangerous when the president uses those terms, because it just confuses the issue. It makes it very difficult for people to really know what exactly is happening at the border, what exactly happens with asylum seekers. And Valeria Luiselli's book was really useful in that regard for them. And then in terms of the stories that they're writing, I remember recently, for example, one of them wrote a piece about being of Mexican background but not speaking Spanish, and sort of the embarrassment that comes from that. And then student after student would raise their hand and say, I found this story to be so close to my own experience, because they oftentimes had that same experience. And I feel like I learned so much from being in the classroom with them, because they bring such a clear perspective and a lived perspective and a complex perspective on the issue of immigration. So I love it.
You'll have to hear what they think of your novel. I'm sure they will be telling you. Laila, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
Laila Lalami's new book is called The Other Americans novel. Here's something for book club fans. The June book club pick for Now Read This, the club co-hosted by the New York Times Book Review and PBS NewsHour, will be reading Daniel Mendelssohn's beautiful and moving memoir, An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. Please do join us as we read the perfect book for Father's Day, to be discussed with the author later this month on the NewsHour and on our Facebook page, Now Read This. Jenny Odell joins us from Oakland, California. She is an artist and a writer who teaches at Stanford University. Her new book is called How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. And I have to read a little bit more of her biography, because she has been an artist in residence at places such as the San Francisco Dump, Facebook, the Internet Archive, and the San Francisco Planning Department, which is not a usual author description. So, Jenny, thanks for being here. And I'd love to start off hearing a little bit more about some of those gigs as an artist in residence.
Yeah, I seem to have a long history of being the odd one out, the one artist in a kind of strange situation. And I have to say that by far my favorite one was the residency at the Dump.
Yeah, that's the one I want to hear about most.
Yeah, I am so nostalgic for that summer. Still, yeah, so that residency program has been going on for more than 25 years. And so they have 3 artists at a time, 3 times a year. And you basically get a studio that's on the premises. Mm-hmm. And then you have access to the public disposal area. So that is not like garbage bag garbage. It's more kind of giant U-Hauls full of stuff where you have people or businesses decluttering. So It can still be pretty gross, but it's more sort of like identifiable objects in there. And my project there that I decided to do was to basically collect, photograph, like very carefully photograph and research the manufacturing origins of as many objects as was humanly possible to do while it was there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like a day at work. I mean, did you go to the dump every day and your two fellow artists are also there every day and you're there sort of picking through, or how does that work?
Because the residencies are all year, it kind of depends. Since we were there in the summer, we had the luxury of going, the other artist that was in the same studio space as me, we both teach. So in the summer, we had the luxury of going in there every day. So yes, that is how it would look. You would show up, you would put on your safety gear and your helmet and your steel-toed boots, and you get a shopping cart, and you go with your shopping cart into the public disposal area, which is actually a very hazardous space because, you have like giant trucks backing in and dumpsters that are overflowing and lots of, just sharp materials, and it's super loud. So it's kind of like a dramatic space to be in. So you'd get your stuff in there and then you'd kind of take it back to your studio and sort through it. And honestly, that's all I did that summer.
That's something that would be considered like a hardship post in the journalism world. But is this a sought after residency in the world of Bay Area artists?
Oh, absolutely.
Everyone wants to be at the dump.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if you are in the Bay Area and you're doing, good work, like you sort of at some point go through that residency program, which is really great because you get to see all these different approaches to the same kind of space.
What was the central idea behind that project at the dump? And does it have any kind of ties to the central idea and the sort of themes that you're exploring in this new book?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're almost, to me, like two expressions of the same thing. So really, like the lesson that I learned when I was at the dump was you could walk into the dump blindfolded and just pick something up off the floor. And if there's enough, information on it, or you have enough traction to at least find out something about it and kind of start going down that rabbit hole, every object leads to some kind of interesting story. There was always something surprising, and it was very humbling. Sort of by the end, I realized how little I know about anything, about how anything is made, and like why I would think anything is interesting. I also realized that there's no such thing as trash because it's just basically a decision that you make about an object that oftentimes hasn't changed. So, given that so much of my book is about attention, I mean the book to be the sort of invitation to do something similar with everything that's around you. So, and I think that that's something that's unfortunately a little bit eroded by the attention economy, is this ability to kind of focus in on one thing, even if it seems banal, and kind of really observe that thing very closely and feel curious about it.
Let's talk about that phrase, attention economy, because the title of your book, again, it's How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. And you get the sense that each of those words is chosen very deliberately because people talk about attention and the lack thereof due primarily to our, let's just blame it on the internet. But you use the word economy, and that feels like a deliberate choice. What do you mean by that?
So I kind of mean that on two levels. Literally, I mean, what people commonly kind of refer to when they use the phrase attention economy, which is just basically through design, this attempted capture of our attention on social media and other platforms. So that's just quite simply the buying and selling of attention, which is obviously bound up with ideas of time, like how much time you're spending engaging with something. But then I think on top of that, it plays into a larger idea that one needs to be online all the time, that if you don't express yourself online, you kind of no longer exist. And ideas of the personal brand. I think there are these kind of like broader kinds of thinking or mentalities that come out of what is literally the attention economy that I also kind of count as part of that.
You describe the book as an activist book disguised as a self-help book. What is it ideally that you would want people to come away with after reading it?
I will say that right after that, I say that I'm not sure if it's either one. So I think, like the book is really addressed to the individual. And something that I say, I think around that part of the book is that I hope that it restores individuals that will in turn help restore communities. And so even though, the book is coming from my personal perspective and it's addressed to another, person's perspective, I do ultimately hope that it not only helps someone think more clearly or broadly and also just enjoy proliferating one's own attention, but that ultimately that would make it easier for you to have dialogues, not just with yourself, but with others. I kind of feel like what's missing from the current conversation about, the attention economy is how even in efforts to divest our attention from the attention economy, things like screen time or being more aware of how you interact with devices, it feels still so individualized to me. It's like we all have this private, shameful struggle with our phones or something. And for me, what's missing is that like you are actually, in a world with other people, both friends and strangers, and that, this is something that we can work on individually, but also together.
Given how much of this is individual, how do you personally deal with that struggle with screen time and that effort to sort of resist those calls?
There's something very simple about the book, which is that I ultimately found a kind of anchor in physical reality, just sort of like looking up and perceptually just grabbing on to whatever and whoever is there. I find to be something that I come back to over and over again that's always been useful for me. So it's so simple. It's almost like the opposite of going to a really expensive digital detox retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And not only is it cheaper, the goal is different. Like if you go to a digital detox retreat, the idea is that you're supposed to be refreshed and then go back to work on Monday and feel more productive, actually engage more with that same system of productivity that I'm critiquing. Whereas, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's just me, but when I see another form of life, like a bird, it doesn't make me more productive. It makes me think about how strange like life is. I'd rather be reminded of that.
Right. So the end goal is different, not just the process of limiting your exposure to those kind of calls at your attention from devices, but actually changing the whole framework of the argument around why we should disengage.
Exactly.
The first sentence of your book, I'd love you to talk about, it's nothing is harder to do than nothing. Why? Why is it that nothing is harder to do than nothing?
It's hard to do nothing if you are a person who, engages in social media and you use these technologies. They are designed to keep you there. So, it's difficult for that reason. But then it's also difficult just because, at least in the first world, we have like this, we've been marinating in this culture of what progress means and what productivity means. These ideas that to be productive, you're putting something new into the world that wasn't there, that you have something to show for your time. And there are these other ideas, like maintenance and care, things that we all, if we were to think about it for any amount of time, we realize are also very necessary and important in being alive. But these are not kind of talked about with the same language of productivity. And we don't have deliverables or things to show for our time when we do those things. So I think some of it's just a really like culturally ingrained problem with how we think time is money and what we should be spending it on.
I'd love to end with a story that you tell in the book, the story of the trainee. Can you tell us about that?
That's one of my favorite performance art pieces. And it was basically a piece where a Finnish performance artist got a job at Deloitte as, I think, an intern, and basically would just sit at her desk and not do anything and just stare into space. She would also ride the elevators up and down without doing anything. And if anyone asked her what she was doing, she would say she was doing thought work.
I mean, it's very persuasive sounding. Like you could totally hear someone saying that in an office today, and like people just being like, okay, then, like, I guess I'm not up on that.
Yeah. But if they were only doing that, right? Like
Right.
It would become sort of unsettling.
So what did people do? Like, what was the response?
So it sounds like people kind of freaked out a little bit. And so there's, in the documentation of the work, there's some really funny emails that get sent where, someone says like, oh, she's at it again. She's staring out the window. Like, does anyone know what's going on with this marketing intern? And, eventually they find out that it's a performance art piece. But in the curatorial text about it, someone mentions that it's ironic because actually doing nothing at work, especially something like an office job, is very common, and everyone's used to, someone looking at Facebook on work time. It was just the image of someone sitting and staring into space that was so galling for people. Like, it was just an unsettling thing to see. And so I talk about that piece in the book as sort of an example of, not only how much the image and the sort of figure of doing nothing is still so unusual for us, but also just how little you actually have to do to kind of not conform to this stream of productivity and the way that we're supposed to be conducting ourselves. Just the fact of someone sitting at a desk and not doing anything, it doesn't sound like a lot, but clearly in this office, it was a huge deal.
Yeah, I love that, that from the email that you quote in the book that it says, subject marketing trainee, importance, high. Just like that there was this level of urgency of like, what are we going to do with this sort of like silent internal Bartleby? And If you were to say to someone who is in the economy every day, sitting in an office, not a finished performance artist, but sort of expected to go about their daily workday, and they have to be on the internet, and they are hooked to its tentacles in the various ways that all of us are, keeping that intention in mind that, again, the object is not to increase productivity or efficiency or optimize anything. What would you say is sort of a good way to do nothing or to think about it?
It's difficult, right? Because a lot of people, don't have the time to do a lot of things that I am doing in the book. But I think one of the most important parts of the book, especially where I'm talking about art pieces that have taught me how to look at things differently, is that I think you can sort of move your attention around even while you're doing something sometimes, or, like let's say you're on your way somewhere. I think there are these kind of interstitial spaces. Again, this is not true for everyone, but in a sort of daily routine where you can take these small opportunities to kind of, as I said, kind of drop out of that stream of kind of forward pressing and productive time. I mean, I've had very profound moments waiting in line at the grocery store, honestly. And I think it just has to do with kind of like unlinking your mindset from whatever is the habitual way that you look at something or look at a space, just even in a small way, shifting it over and looking at everything from a slightly different angle. I find that very quickly everything becomes very strange, sometimes terrifying, sometimes fascinating, but not, what you thought it was. And so, I think several times in the book, I invoke this image of things that grow in the cracks in the sidewalk. That's a little bit how I feel about it. It's like, yes, we are all, and again, differently being subjected to all of these pressures. But I think that there are these kind of, if you can find these small spaces where you can kind of step to the side, even if it's not that long, I still think it makes a really big difference.
All right. I'm going to find a way to work in some nothing into my day. Jenny, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Jenny Odell is the author of How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we're going to talk about some controversial books, but not the Mueller Report, right? Other controversial books.
I mean, we might want to mention the Mueller Report. It's
All
number
right.
one.
How can you not mention it?
Number one bestseller. I talk about it every week.
It's the number one bestseller and I think like the number 8 bestseller, right?
Amazingly. Yeah, there's so many editions of it. It's always interesting to me when a free document still sells. But anyway, yeah, I was interested to see
Same
where
thing
it
with
would
free
land.
water.
Exactly. Bottle it and sell it. That's the theory. Yeah, so there are many, many controversial books, particularly in the world of young adult publishing, where there's always some simmering dissent, on the internet. But there was one in particular that got a lot of attention earlier this year, which was Amelie Wenzao's Blood Heir. It was supposed to come out in the summer. It was one of Delacourte's big debut fantasy novels for the summer. And the author decided to cancel the June publication of the novel after getting major pushback online on Twitter, on Goodreads, from critics who said that she was insensitive in her portrayal of slavery. So after sitting with that decision for a while, she actually went back to the manuscript, reread it, and decided, it actually wasn't as critics had portrayed it, and she is, in fact, going to publish it this fall. So that's sort of interesting to me because we've had a sort of cycle of books getting pulled or canceled, and we've had other instances where they were delayed and rewritten. But this was sort of a very rapid one. So
now, Zhao herself is an immigrant from China.
That's right.
And she is 25 now, wrote this book.
I think she's 26, yeah. 26. So she's young,
ancient. So she wrote this book at a really impressively young age. And my understanding is that the controversy had to do with her handling of slavery and of people of apparently different races and ethnicities as portrayed in a fantasy world. And her response to that, if I'm correct, but correct me if I'm wrong, was that in a global context, slavery may have operated in a different way than it did here in the United States, and that she was looking at slavery coming more from her own experience as an immigrant from Asia.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the fantasy world is sort of a Russian-esque empire, and there are different races, and that was one issue that people sort of seized upon. But in her explanation, and I haven't had the opportunity to read the book, so I'm sort of going on the publisher's explanation and her own description, she was really trying to draw a parallel to indentured servitude and human trafficking in Asia, which she apparently has studied as a student and, is something that she was aware of. She grew up in China. She was born in Paris, but grew up largely in Beijing, went to an international school, and only came to the U.S. for college, and now she works in finance. So she also drew on her experience of being an immigrant, she said, and sort of her feeling of not having a voice politically and not really having much power. So that was sort of a theme that she was trying to tease out as well. But again, I think the reason people really were alarmed by the response to her book was not just because it was not out yet and everyone was criticizing it, because that's happened before. It was kind of the speed at which she decided to sort of put the brakes on it. Because I think people thought, wow, the outrage cycle has really accelerated to the point where authors themselves feel the need to stand down if they're criticized. And since her book came out, it happened again with Kosako Jackson's young adult novel, A Place for Wolves, which he also canceled.
Question about Zhao's book. You mentioned the speed with which she self-corrected. Did she talk to you about sort of why she canceled the books and so quickly? I mean, was it just, did she panic?
She was extremely shocked and overwhelmed and taken aback because she just, didn't anticipate that degree and level of criticism so far ahead of publication. I think she also felt pressured to take strong action because, these were diverse voices often saying that she had handled issues of race insensitively. And as somebody who is a minority herself and an immigrant, I think that critique was particularly meaningful to her. I think she said she did want to listen to those voices. And they did make some changes to the text. They had additional readers look at those passages in particular that had drawn scrutiny. They had a couple of sensitivity readers, and they had some academics look at it to make sure. She wanted to make sure that the context of the book wouldn't be misread as sort of reflecting or drawing a parallel to American history and slavery in this country, but rather to human trafficking and indentured servitude in Asia. What's interesting to me, too, and I've talked to a few experts about this, because obviously everybody in children's publishing is concerned about diversity. It's a major issue for writers, publishers, readers, librarians. And part of that, of course, is getting diverse authors to write about their own cultural experience. But another question is often, how far outside of your own experience can you write? And the answer is often you can write anything as long as you do it in a way that captures that experience, that doesn't perpetuate stereotypes, that doesn't misrepresent a culture that you're maybe not from. So that's the answer that I often hear from librarians and publishers in terms of what they're looking for. But it's interesting, too, that fantasy is such a minefield, because I think fantasy is often a genre that allows writers to draw parallels to the real world in sort of more heightened ways. And often they are taking on issues that are very controversial, sensitive, and fantasy is supposed to add a layer of remove, but people read into it, obviously. And so it doesn't necessarily give you an additional buffer to set your book in a fantasy world.
I mean, one thing we know for sure here at the Book Review is that not everyone is happy with every book. Not everyone likes every book. But this is not the only book that has been pulled from the shelves, that plans have changed. And it's also happened in the grown-up world, too.
Yeah, less frequently it happens in adult fiction, but there was a case recently which was rather interesting to me. It was this author, Hesh Keston, whose novel, The Siege of Tel Aviv, was very controversial. It's about the conquest of Israel by Arab armies, and the novel was pulled by Zonk Books. It was actually after its release, so in this case it was a larger group of readers reacting to it. He has decided to self-publish it and make it available to readers anyway, so it's still out there.
So what was the controversy?
I haven't read the book, but from what I understand, when they've read in terms of the coverage of why it was withdrawn, people were pointing out that it had very stereotypical portrayals of Palestinians and sexist portrayals of the female characters. And I think there was a certain degree of Islamophobia that people saw in the portrayal of the Muslim characters. So again, when books are pulled, there's often this question of, well, does that amount to censorship? But he's made his book available, so there are ways around it if you can't find a publisher or if your publisher feels like maybe this was a bad call.
And if readers want to decide for themselves, they can then read his book. And when will they be able to read Zhao's book? When is that going to be published?
That is going to be published this November, so it'll be a big fall book for Delacorte.
All right. I'm sure we will be hearing from readers about that. Thanks so much, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are critics Dwight Garner, Jennifer Salai, and Parl Sagel. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Jen. What have you reviewed most recently?
So last week I reviewed this book called Mind Fixers by a historian of science at Harvard named Anne Harrington. And it's the history of psychiatry's search for the biological origins of mental illness. And the occasion for the book, she says, is that psychiatry as a field is in a moment of crisis right now. So since the 80s, there was what was called a biological revolution in psychiatry, where psychiatrists in general started pursuing medication at the expense of talk therapy, essentially. And what she's saying is that biological revolution now has come to a point where even within the field, psychiatrists are beginning to reckon with the fact that perhaps they've over-medicated, they've overreached as a discipline. And not only that, but the search for the biological markers of mental illness has actually not come to anything so far. That's not to say that it might not in the future, but if you think about it, the diagnostic categories of psychiatry are all still based on clinical symptoms. So you go to a psychiatrist, you can't take a blood test for mental illness, but they will look at your symptoms and then prescribe accordingly. And oftentimes this does work, but sometimes it doesn't. And so she's looking at the history of this search, and this history of this search has gone on for the past century or so. And there was a period of time after World War II where, in the United States at least, the Freudians essentially took over. And so talk therapy became sort of the main approach of the field. And this was something that the more scientifically minded psychiatrists were reacting against, because the Freudians, as much help as they were able to provide, they also essentially turned into this discipline that really, I think a lot of families felt stigmatized because they felt blamed for instance, their children's mental illness.
The refrigerator mother and all of that.
Right, exactly. And so, this biological approach offered this way to sort of remove the stigma. And for a while it did, but then it turned into its own sort of coterie of powerful people. And so she's saying that there's a reaction to this right now, and she offers this history, and she really traces it, I guess, from the end of the 19th century, where biology really did reign for a while, but it was more sort of anatomically focused, and that's where we have eugenics, things like that, and then goes to look at sort of the Freudian dispensation, and then turns toward the 1980s where things changed again. And it's a really fascinating look. And she's a very clear writer. I should say that the history is much more complicated and convoluted than I think the sort of sketch of it seems. But she's a very careful writer and careful researcher. And she tries as much as she can to be very, very fair, I think, and understanding of the different approaches.
Does she have prescriptions going forward?
Well, so that's sort of the interesting thing. I mean, her prescriptions are a little bit vaguer. I mean,
how could they not be?
Right,
For
exactly.
this world and industry to change, what has to happen?
Right, exactly. So she's basically saying that, it's the onus is on psychiatrists to basically embrace humility and not...
Doctors are very good at that.
Right, exactly. and not see science as some sort of salvation, and not see themselves as some sort of salvation for their patients. And really, she also says that psychiatry should focus on the most serious and most severe forms of mental illness, and, maybe leave more room for social workers and psychotherapists to do their work. So that's basically her plan. But it's a really fascinating history.
Nothing prescriptive, Dwight, about the book that you read.
I reviewed the new novel from Ali Smith, who's a Scottish novelist, playwright, journalist, whose reputation has been increasing and increasing over the past decade, I would say. And she's embarked on this seasonal cycle of 4 novels. And her new one is called Spring, and it's the third following autumn and winter, of course. And
not that I was keeping track, but Knausgaard was doing the same thing. Did he finish with his seasons
I am
first?
not
Yeah,
sure.
he's finished.
He's done.
I can't keep up with Knausgaardian
But, like-
cycles anymore. I dealt with the 6 of them,
But
of my
also,
lives.
His seasons are like entries on buttons, lice. Like they're kind of prose poem-y. Like she's writing proper novels.
Proper novels, yeah, but they're very experimental in a way. She's writing one a year. I kind of like that. It's funny. I wrote a piece about this once. I kind of like the one a year or one every other year model for fiction writers. I don't necessarily need I'm not talking down ambition in any way, and big novels are terrific. But there's something in me that likes the writer who brings one out every year or two. This, like Woody Allen used to do with his movies, like Bellow did for a long time in the 60s, like Updike did for a while in the 70s, I believe. And and Ali Smith is releasing these novels one a year, and so now we have Spring. They're sort of dream states, but they're very political. They're very politically minded. The Autumn book had a lot to say about Brexit, and it came out just on the heels of Brexit. So she clearly wrote it in a fit of pique. The new one is about migrant detention centers and Brexit, and of course a bit about Trump and a bit about everything else. In a way, it's a cranky old person's novel, and yet she doesn't write like a cranky old person. It's several stories are going on. One's about a filmmaker, a man who is sort of searching, who is bereft after the death of a close friend, and partly it's about a young girl who is sort of a savant of activism who begins to help out migrants or immigrants who are in detention in England. But Ali Smith's method is sort of feel her way through these stories, and there are little interpolary sections that break off and talk about politics and talk about other things. But as I said in my review, she's one of those writers who she reminds me of the filmmaker Mike Leigh a little bit in the sense that she has this very determined, very particular vision. And even when her work isn't great, you kind of know that it's Mike Leigh, it's Ali Smith. You just feel this sort of sense of, And so I love her. I mean, I will read her no matter what. Even though this is not my favorite book in this series, I still think it's pretty terrific.
Today I love you, Dwight, for articulating a subgenre of which I'm a fan, and I didn't realize it until now, which is the cranky old person novel.
Well, it's my specialty personally. And everything
Novel,
that I
biography, you like them all.
Paul, you didn't write a review this week, but
No.
an essay.
Yeah, I was noticing a while ago that so many different books are being described as Me Too novels. Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, Those Who Knew by Idra Novi, just goes on and on. Westerns, dystopias. In reviews, people were calling them Me Too novels. Some of the writers themselves were saying that they'd written them explicitly thinking about Me Too. And so I wanted to look at what that means. And my idea originally was that this is a terrible thing to do, that we cannot look at these novels that should stand on their own through the lens of this movement. And of course I was wrong, because I sat down and I read all of these books, and I found instead of this kind of lens being reductive or boring, I found that these books read in this moment, and we're all of us reading so many op-eds and testimonials and essays and think pieces. These books are the space where I found my own experience and people's experiences and what they've heard and what they feel is true, because it's full of doubt. Mm-hmm. It's full of, am I correct to think that? Did I see that? Is that exactly what happened? Is she telling the truth? Is he telling the truth? There's all of this space for these kinds of questions. And then there's a space for the question of, now what? How is punishment different from justice? How do we talk about accountability? And you just see the novel doing what almost no other technology or anything else can do, which is stage these questions. And so, it was a really interesting week to sit there and to have that experience I think has been missing for me, which was to feel people thinking, not performing thought, not pronouncing. And I understand that that's the job of the op-ed, that's the job of certain kinds of writing. But to see actually these writers talk about what is a habit of mind that is necessary in this moment and actually useful to people as they go about negotiating this moment where so much seems to be in flux. People's reputations, stories they thought they knew, memories of the past themselves. Everything seems to be untethered. So the novel is in a really interesting, good place, useful place too.
I thought it was so interesting that whereas it feels very dangerous to have any kind of questioning or nuance or gray area in the realm of journalism or opinion, that in fiction you have the freedom.
You have the freedom because it's something, and I was like, this is again, like these pieces are short, but I had this like longer section that got cut but it was to do with like the inwardness of the novel. And it's to do with the fact that, when we're writing journalism, even a review, we're imagining it being read pretty quickly, right? Like we're always on the back of my mind, somebody's going to read this. We imagine ourselves being overheard. But the novel creates this feeling of inwardness for the writer as well as the reader. And you really just get to experiment and to have this different experience of situations and knowledge and certainty that feels really exciting. And also on top of it, Dwight has reviewed a number of these books. The books are also just really good to read, standing on their own, even without being attached to any kind of movement. Trust Exercise, which you reviewed, Dwight, is so fantastic.
I think it's the best thing I've read this year, probably.
And you read it goes down like ice cream, but then you stop and you say, what? And you go back and I read it again and again, and you just keep noticing things. You notice like that artful construction.
Let's have it out about Milkman. Did you like? Because famously, I'm the only person in America in the Western world who didn't like Milkman.
I did like Milkman.
Yeah,
I did. I mean,
talk to me about it.
Well, I think for me, it felt like music. It was just the rhythms of the book. I just found it hypnotic. I found so Milkman. For those who haven't read it, won the Man Booker last year. It's by Anna Burns. And it
Irish, and it won the National Book Critics Circle also, didn't it? Just recently, I believe.
Yeah, just as a rejoinder to you, I feel.
Exactly. I take pride.
It's the story of this very isolated 18-year-old who's being stalked by this shadowy paramilitary figure. And the book itself is very delivered in the stream of conscious narration. And, there are really no proper nouns. It's kind of Baroque in places. I mean, it's not an easy read by any means, but I felt myself very seduced and carried along by its rhythms. And I think it's also because I was reading so many other books that felt very different, right? That were much plainer and conventional. So it felt like an interesting stylistic departure this week for me to go then to this place.
All right. Before we go, I want to bring up an email that we got from one of our listeners, John Browner, who hails from Munich. He is the owner of a bookstore called the Munich Readery, which is apparently the largest English secondhand bookshop in Germany. And he writes to us asking us to talk a little bit more about our favorite used bookstores. And I think our critics have some opinions about those. Dwight, do you have a favorite used bookstore?
Well, I mean, you live in New York City, you go to the Strand. I mean, there are many used bookstores that I like, but the Strand is just an amazing, amazing place. What I like about the Strand, and it puts me in mind also of the great bookstore Moe's in Berkeley, is I like stores that mix the secondhand with the new stuff together, and that's what you get at the Strand. And it enriches your browsing experience because you get more of the author in one place, and you can see they'll have every Iris Murdoch novel, some of them brand new paperback, you'll pay full freight for, and others for $1 because they're beaten up old penguins.
Yeah, I was there on Sunday, and I was in the kids section, which I think maybe has fewer old books, used books than new for whatever reason, and ended up spending $128 on all new books.
But the store, the used bookstore I love the most and look forward to going to is a place called Monroe Street Books, and it's just outside of Middlebury, Vermont. I went to college at Middlebury, and my daughter's there now, so luckily for me, I get the chance to go and visit this bookstore. And it's just a big old cave by the side of the road, and it's massive. And one of those bookstores, you have to get up on the ladder sometimes, and you're up there 30 feet off the ground looking at something. They will hate to hear that I said this because you're probably not supposed to be up on those ladders. But the people who own it just have great taste. You walk in there, you're just like, my God, there's no crap in here. It's all just excellent, excellent stuff. So I just have a hard time. I like a used bookstore. You feel like someone is presiding.
See, I kind of like the crap. I differ from you there. I sort of like really outdated and unfashionable books, unless that's part of good taste.
It depends
for
how
you.
we define crap, I guess. I like to find some weird stuff, but I don't need to see 1,000 Nora Roberts novels, in my used bookstore. But I know what you're saying.
Good crap is what I meant.
Good crap.
Jen, do you have a favorite used bookstore?
Well, so Dwight mentioned the Strand, which I think is, sort of my go-to. And then I used to work downtown, not far from the Strand, and there used to be more of them, but there still are some guys on West 4th Street who have their tables out and they sell used books. And it's always interesting to see what they have. They often have a lot of philosophy. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if it's because of the neighborhood, because it's near NYU, but I feel like I've gotten a bunch of interesting books there. So it's always nice to go there and then also talk to them, and they're always open to suggestions, and they'll say that they'll keep something in mind. And if you keep coming back, then sometimes you'll see something that you've asked whether or not they've had, and they don't have it then, but then they'll have it in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Right.
Pearl?
So the used bookstore of my heart, like Dwight, is my college used bookstore. It's Word in Montreal. And I would say, like, I feel like I must have cleaned them out over the years. And it's, again, it was a very amazing collection. It's still, run with a great deal of taste. But there's also, like, that interesting, fun jumble. So you're kind of coming across stuff. There is a new used bookstore that I like. Not new, but, there's one that I've discovered on the Upper West Side. There's a character in Tropic of Cancer who never wants other people to know what he's reading. I kind of don't want to tell people where this is because it's lovely, but it's on the Upper West Side.
Is it teeny weeny?
It's tiny.
Oh, that one where you
what
kind of
you're
walk
talking
in.
about.
It's, little,
It's like a storefront.
To the left is a big wall.
It's incredible. But this is also, so I'm always on the hunt, I think, for other new places. Unnameable Books in Brooklyn also has some really good stuff. Really, and interesting philosophy, interesting academic stuff.
Well, I feel a pressure to up our global game here since our friendly listener, John Browner, hails from Munich. So I'm going to talk about one bookstore that I love that's a tiny bookstore in London called Marchpane. Do you know this bookstore?
I don't.
It's in the theater district, and it's only children's books and full of great treasures, like things that I think the last time I was there had like Enid Blyton, for whatever reason, retelling the story of Winnie the Pooh, which, like why? But there it was.
Random collab.
Yes. And, they have valuable things and then sort of throwaways, but I like the focus of it. So let's just run through one last time for people who are jotting these down, the names of these stores. Dwight?
I talked about the Strand, and I talked about Monroe Street Books, just outside of Middlebury, Vermont.
And I talked about the guys on West 4th Street.
They don't need a name.
And I talked about The Word in Montreal.
And also this mysterious little bookshop that she's not telling us where it is.
Name.
And Marchpane in London. So thanks again to John Browner for the suggestion. All right, let's go through those book titles one more time. Dwight, you reviewed?
Spring by Ali Smith.
Jen?
Mind Fixers by Anne Harrington.
And give us a few of the books you talked about in your essay, Pearl.
Milkman by Anna Burns. Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, Those Who Knew, Idra Novi.
All right, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, Don Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.